We begin in the middle of a moment many workers never saw coming. A congressional hearing that ICE leadership had prepared for, rehearsed for, and strategized for. A sudden question. A bright camera flash illuminating Acting Director Todd Lyons. An answer that sounds defensive, because it is. This hearing didn't unfold over weeks. It unfolded in 4 hours. 4 hours that could define mass deportation policy. 4 hours that could expose enforcement contradictions. 4 hours that could reveal exactly how vulnerable your workplace really is. One wrong assumption here, and you could be standing in that workplace when ICE shows up tomorrow. What Lyons defended crossed a line that workers hoped wouldn't hold. And when that line was tested under oath, immigrant advocates did not hesitate. They responded with testimony, documentation, and first-hand accounts so damaging they revealed cracks in the entire deportation strategy. Most people ignore congressional hearings. They make the same mistake. They fall straight into the trap. But today, you're going to do something different. For 3 months now, there had been signals, not from official ICE statements, not from Department of Homeland Security press releases, just signals, that Acting Director Todd Lyons was preparing something unprecedented with CBP head Benjamin Scott. Lyons has been aggressive, yes, but also increasingly defensive about that approach. His actions followed a pattern, a justification, almost a script. But what triggered concern among labor organizers this week was that the pattern was finally being challenged publicly. Experts who monitor congressional oversight recognize the indicators. The hostile questioning, the prepared deflections, the carefully rehearsed talking points, the sudden worker testimonies contradicting official narratives. And when ICE leadership gets grilled under oath, the truth about enforcement becomes unavoidable. Committee members noticed something else. The questions being asked weren't just about numbers. They were about families separated during workplace raids. They were about workers detained despite having pending applications. They were about children left without parents after enforcement operations. They were about the human cost of mass deportation that statistics never capture. For immigrant workers watching from kitchens, construction sites, and warehouses across America, this wasn't political theater. For families who lost breadwinners to ICE raids, this wasn't abstract policy debate. For communities where entire workforces disappeared overnight, this was finally someone asking the questions that mattered. The hearing was supposed to provide answers. Instead, it exposed how little accountability exists in the system. Early Thursday morning, congressional staffers detected what they described as coordinated testimony preparation, including talking points circulated among DHS officials not seen since the previous administration's family separation hearings. These are tactics federal agencies only deploy when facing hostile oversight. Extensive media training, synchronized messaging across departments, pre-scripted responses to anticipated questions, or complete deflection when questions become too specific. Observers weren't sure which strategy Lyons would use, or whether he'd cycle through all of them. But one thing was clear. ICE leadership knew this hearing would be confrontational, and when agencies prepare for confrontation, they're defending something they know is indefensible. Behind the scenes, immigrant worker organizations had been coordinating something powerful. Not protests outside the hearing, not symbolic demonstrations, actual testimony. Workers who survived raids, families separated by enforcement, employers who witnessed operations, legal advocates with documentation of civil rights violations. They came prepared with names, dates, locations, and evidence that directly contradicted ICE's official narrative about targeted enforcement. The pushback issued by workers and advocates during this hearing was not symbolic. It was not emotional testimony dismissed as biased. It was documented evidence. Witness after witness described enforcement operations as indiscriminate, traumatic, and fundamentally different from what Lyons claimed under oath. But testimony only matters if legislators listen. Some did. Their response was among the most pointed questioning ICE leadership has faced in years. They didn't just ask about deportation numbers. They asked about specific cases, They named specific workplaces. They demanded explanations for specific separations. They forced Lyons to defend individual decisions instead of hiding behind aggregate statistics. And when you force enforcement officials to defend individual cases, the system's cruelty becomes undeniable. Today, congressional testimony confirmed that Acting ICE Director Todd Lyons defended mass deportation operations targeting workplaces, including meatpacking plants that had recently been raided for what Lyons described as criminal investigations into unauthorized workers. He testified before Democrats challenged his characterization. He defended operations before witnesses contradicted his timeline. He claimed enforcement was humane before family members described trauma that directly refuted that claim. This wasn't miscommunication. It was competing realities. And that's what made the hearing so explosive. Because when ICE's version of events conflicts with workers' lived experiences, someone is lying. And the documented evidence presented to Congress made clear who. Inside the hearing room, tensions escalated as representative after representative pressed Lyons on specific raids. The Mississippi poultry plant operation that detained nearly 700 workers while their children were at school. The Tennessee meatpacking raid that separated nursing mothers from infants. The Texas construction site sweep that detained workers with pending U visa applications. Lyons defended each operation using identical language: targeted enforcement, criminal investigations, public safety priorities, lawful removals of individuals with final orders. But workers who testified told different stories. They described agents entering workplaces without warrants. They recounted being detained despite having work authorization applications pending. They explained being separated from children without any notification process. They documented being held in facilities without access to attorneys or ability to contact family. Those aren't targeted operations. Those are mass arrests with catastrophic human consequences. The most damaging testimony came from a mother whose husband was deported after an ICE raid at his construction job. She brought documentation showing he had a pending adjustment of status application. Documentation showing ICE was notified of that pending application. Documentation showing they deported him anyway. Lyons claimed he wasn't familiar with that specific case. But when pressed, he couldn't deny the pattern. Couldn't explain why enforcement operations regularly detain people with pending applications. Couldn't justify why agents don't verify status before removal. His answer? That's not ICE's responsibility. Their responsibility is enforcing final orders. But when final orders include people who never received notice of hearings, who were deported in absentia, who have pending motions to reopen, calling that enforcement targeted is Orwellian. CBP head Benjamin Scott faced equally hostile questioning about border enforcement operations that resulted in family separations. Democrats pressed him on cases where asylum seekers were turned away at ports of entry, cases where unaccompanied minors were detained in adult facilities, cases where medical emergencies were ignored during processing. Scott's defense mirrored Lyons: policy compliance, legal authority, operational necessity. He claimed every action followed established protocols. But advocates testified that protocols themselves violate human rights, that legal doesn't mean moral, that operational necessity doesn't justify trauma. And when federal officials defend the process rather than the outcome, they've already lost the moral argument. Worker organizations used this hearing to expose something ICE desperately wants hidden. Mass deportation operations aren't removing criminals and threats. They're removing workers. Workers who pay taxes through ITIN numbers. Workers who've been in the U.S. for decades. Workers with U.S. citizen children. Workers who are the sole income earners for families. Workers whose removal creates immediate poverty for American kids. The economic devastation following workplace raids is well documented. Entire communities lose spending power overnight. Schools see enrollment drop as families flee. Local businesses close because their customer base disappeared. Housing markets crash because renters vanish. None of that appears in ICE's metrics of successful enforcement. They count removals. They don't count children who go hungry because dad was deported. They don't count businesses that close. They don't count communities destroyed. And when you only measure success by deportation numbers, you create incentives for maximum removal, regardless of consequences. Immigration attorneys testified about another disturbing pattern. ICE using workplace raids to inflate deportation statistics by targeting people who are easy to remove rather than people who pose actual threats. A person with a criminal conviction requires extensive legal process before removal. They have appeal rights, public defenders, court hearings, potentially years of litigation. A person whose only violation is working without authorization? They can be deported in days. No lengthy appeals, no complicated legal arguments, just quick removal that counts toward quotas. So ICE raids workplaces. They arrest hundreds of people at once. They process removals rapidly. And suddenly their numbers look impressive. But those numbers represent destroyed families, not improved public safety. The hearing revealed the disconnect between what Trump promised and what ICE actually does. Trump campaigned on removing criminal aliens, but workplace raids don't target criminals, they target convenient deportations. Lyons tried defending this by claiming workplace enforcement sends a deterrent message, that seeing co-workers detained discourages unauthorized employment. But workers who testified destroyed that argument. They explained that raids don't deter employment, they just drive it further underground. Workers become more vulnerable to exploitation because they're more afraid to report violations. Employers gain more power because workers won't complain about conditions for fear of ICE. Mass deportation doesn't reduce unauthorized immigration, it just makes unauthorized immigrants more exploitable. One of the most powerful testimonies came from an employer, a construction company owner who witnessed an ICE raid at his job site. He explained that agents detained workers indiscriminately. They didn't verify employment authorization. They didn't check for pending applications. They just rounded up everyone who looked Latino. 3 of the detained workers were U.S. citizens. 2 had green cards. 1 was visiting the site as a vendor and didn't even work there. All of them were held for hours before ICE verified their status and released them. No apology, no compensation for time lost, no accountability for the violation. If that happened during a police stop, it would be profiling. When ICE does it at workplaces, they call it enforcement. Workers pushed back against Lyons' characterization of operations as humane and professional. They described agents who refused to let detained workers call family, who separated parents from children without any care coordination, who mocked people crying, who threatened anyone who asked questions. That's not professional enforcement. That's cruelty with legal authority. And when federal officials defend that cruelty as policy, they reveal exactly what mass deportation really means. Democrats on the committee pressed Lyons on specific policy questions he couldn't answer. What happens to U.S. citizen children when both parents are deported? ICE doesn't track that. How many people with pending applications are removed annually? ICE doesn't maintain those statistics. How many workplace raids result in criminal prosecutions versus civil removals? ICE doesn't differentiate in their data. The agency conducting mass deportation operations can't answer basic questions about the consequences of those operations. That's not oversight failure. That's deliberate ignorance. If ICE tracked how many citizen children lose parents to deportation, they'd have to acknowledge the scale of harm. If they measured how many people with pending applications are removed, they'd have to confront how often the system deports people who should have been allowed to stay. If they analyzed criminal prosecution rates from workplace raids, they'd have to admit most operations target workers, not criminals. So they don't track it. And what isn't measured can't be criticized. Worker organizations are demanding congressional action based on this hearing, not symbolic resolutions, actual legislative changes. Requirements that ICE verify pending applications before removal. Mandates that agents coordinate with child welfare when detaining parents. Prohibitions on workplace raids without specific criminal warrants. Whether Congress acts on those demands remains uncertain, but the hearing accomplished something crucial. It created an official record of mass deportation's human cost. Every testimony is now part of congressional record. Every document submitted is preserved evidence. Every question Lyons couldn't answer is documented evasion. That record matters for future litigation, for policy reform advocacy, for historical accountability. The workers who testified put their safety at risk to create that record. Many are still in removal proceedings. Some are living underground because testifying made them targets. Others lost jobs because employers retaliated for speaking out. They testified anyway, because they understand something crucial. Silence enables abuse. Documentation enables accountability. Truth-telling creates the possibility of change. So what does this hearing mean for immigrant workers right now? First, it confirms what advocates have been saying. ICE workplace enforcement is not targeted. It's not focused on criminals. It's designed to generate maximum deportation numbers, regardless of individual circumstances. Second, it exposes the gap between ICE's public messaging and operational reality. They claim humane enforcement while conducting operations that traumatize children. They promise targeted raids while detaining U.S. citizens. They defend professionalism while workers describe abuse. Third, it demonstrates that congressional oversight is possible when legislators are willing to ask hard questions. This hearing happened because Democrats demanded accountability. That pressure can increase if constituents demand it. Fourth, it shows the power of worker testimony. Personal stories cut through bureaucratic deflection. Documented evidence forces officials to defend indefensible actions. Organized pushback creates political consequences. Fifth, it reveals how vulnerable every workplace is right now. ICE doesn't verify status before raids. They don't check for pending applications. They don't coordinate with families before detention. If you work anywhere in America as an immigrant, you're at risk. Not because you did anything wrong, because ICE operates under policies that treat presence without authorization as sufficient grounds for maximum enforcement. That's the reality this hearing exposed. And that's the reality every immigrant worker needs to understand. As this congressional session continues, more hearings will examine ICE operations. More workers will testify. More evidence will emerge about the human cost of mass deportation. But one thing is already clear. Knowing this right doesn't make you a criminal. It makes you smart. It means you're prepared. It means you're protecting your family. Don't assume workplace raids only target criminals. Don't believe enforcement is humane just because officials say so. Don't think congressional oversight will protect you without organized pressure demanding it. Share this video with every immigrant worker you know. It might save their family one day. Subscribe to USA Immigration Path for more protection. We protect you with real information as the next phase unfolds.